Whilst the Vikings have long been imagined as ruthless pillagers and barbarians, legal proceeding and democracy were incredibly important to their own societies. Many legal words in English stem from Norse, and the Vikings were invited to rule over smaller dominions in Russia in order to introduce their orderly customs. Fundamental to Viking democracy was the Thing. This was a local assembly that gathered at least annually and presided over legal cases. National issues and internal disputes were discussed and resolved at the Thing, with solutions such as the offender paying a fine or even being outlawed. Being outlawed meant that the individual was outside the protection of the law, allowing anyone to kill them and seize their property. This was a useful tool for a victim seeking revenge. The most powerful landholders, called Gudi, formed the law right, which was responsible for creating and changing laws. The laws were traditionally not written down, but remembered and recited by the lögsögamathur, law speaker. However, the Thing was also an opportunity for trade and celebration. The visitors lived in wooden shacks with canvas roofs, feasted copiously, and drank beer. A lot of money could be made from selling beer at the Thing. One of the beersellers at the Icelandic Allthing was a man named Thorhall. He was well off and somewhat aged when our story takes place. He was small, weak and ugly, known to be greedy, but handy with wood and iron, and his sale of homebrewed ale was much appreciated. He had poor eyesight and always wore a hood called a kofri. I presume this sort of hood was pointed, because the name is today bestowed at a mountaintop on Iceland. Because no one really remembered Thorhall's real name, he usually went by the alias of Ölkofri, meaning beer hood. Beer hood had another hobby, that was burning coal. And I mean literally, not what some of you dirty boys are thinking. He produced coal, either for sale or for keeping himself warm in the winter night. This was done by slowly burning wood in a large kiln in the forest. He spent the nights watching over the kiln, but eventually grew so tired that he fell asleep. Beerhood slept very soundly until he was woken up by a crackling noise and a strong heat. The kiln had caught fire and the flames were spreading into the forest. By now it was too late to put it out. Beerhood narrowly escaped a roasting as the forest burned to ash. Though this part of the forest belonged to Beerhood, the fire spread to and destroyed the nearby Gothaskog, known as such due to being owned by 6 Guthi. These were powerful farmers and landholders, one of them being Snorri Thorgrimsson, often called Snorri Guthi. He has appeared in my earlier videos and is seen as a foundational figure in Icelandic history. The 6 Guthi that owned the forest assembled and decided they should sue Beerhood and have him declared an outlaw at the next Thing. A Guthi called Skafti travelled with his men to Beerhood's house and told him of this news. Now, Beerhood had a bit of a prideful streak going on. He arrogantly scoffed in Skafti's face, telling him that he had powerful friends who would help him out. He had sold him beer, after all. Skafti didn't respond. Beerhood smiled, thinking that he had shut up the Gothi for sure. Spring became summer, and so came the Thing. Beerhood was at his usual stand selling beer and trying to convince his old customers to help him in the case, usually after they had a horn or two. They all responded that none of them had benefited from affairs with him, or at least not enough to risk it going toe-to-toe with the island's most powerful nobles. Beerhood now realized the brevity of the situation. He desperately went from shack to shack, but no one was willing to help him out. He had been a prideful, arrogant man, but this situation got the best of him. If he was declared an outlaw, he was surely going to die. A young man named Bradi Bjarnsson had watched his in-law, Thorsten, as he declined Beerhood's plea for help. Brody was around 20 and told his in-law that Beerhood obviously wouldn't do so well as an outlaw. He implied that Beerhood would get his ass kicked by a spiked boot, down a hole full of snakes. The spit lava, oh okay. Brody said that it was petty of these so-called great chieftains to expose Beerhood to such a fate, and that any man worth his salt would help the poor guy out. It was the honorable thing to do. Thorsten told Brody that he was free to help him as he pleased. He in turn would help Brody in any way he could. Brody thanked his in-law and sent for a man to fetch Beerhood. They found him outside the shack, weeping pitiably. The man told him to go inside and stop crying, for you shouldn't sniffle when you stand before Thorsten." Beerhood almost cried out of joy and did as he was told. When he came back inside, Brody said, "It seems as if Thorsten wants to help you anyway, because he finds the case illegitimate. You couldn't possibly have defended their forest, because you couldn't save your own." Beerhood praised Brody for his kindness. Some would call it ass-kissing, and Thorsten now found Brody obliged to help the old man. Well, Brody went outside and took Beerhood with him. They devised a plan, and next, they went to the Thing. Two of the Gothi were seated and discussing law, having just concluded another case. One of them was Skafti, the man that had visited Beerhood during the spring, and told him of their plans to sue him. Beerhood fell to his knees and begged them for forgiveness. He called them all sorts of fine names, and the author of the Saga wrote how it will take a long while to recount all of Beerhood's words. Altogether, he behaved in a very pitiful fashion. This was quite unlike his usual arrogant self, and the two were kind of disgusted. Skafti asked him mockingly where his notorious pride had gone. "When we called you to the Thing in the spring," he said, "you were so sure that you'd win the case. Now where are those chieftains, whom you threatened would help you in this case?" Beerhood replied that he had been mad to say such things, and that those chieftains, as it turned out, were all cowards when faced with a powerful Gothi. He begged the two for assistance, though he said that he understood if they couldn't forgive him. But if he wouldn't receive their help, he'd surely be beaten to death. He repeated the same things over and over again, being so desperate, before finally asking them to arbitrate the case, as in, resolve it outside of court. He even suggested offering them a bribe. The other Gothi told Skafti that he did not believe Beerhood should be judged guilty, but he wasn't sure how the other Gothi would receive this. Skafti declared that since he had been the chief proponent in the case, he'd have the right alone to settle it outside of court. Beerhood rose and they shook hands. He immediately assigned witnesses, first amongst them Brody and his followers. Afterwards, the arbitration commenced. Skafti began by declaring that the offender had asked him for arbitration. And despite him not discussing this with the other Gothi, he believed he had a right to do this. The goal of the arbitration would not to see Beerhood outlawed, but to agree on a monetary compensation, a fine. Finally, he took Beerhood's hand, and declared that his previous accusations were now void. Skafti then told the other Gothi that it'd be best if they got this out of the way. However, Beerhood said suddenly that they shouldn't hurry, for he hadn't chosen if he wanted them over anyone else to speak for him. The Gothis replied that they had agreed that they should oversee the arbitration. Beerhood said, sure, but he hadn't agreed on the two Gothi representing him. The followers of the Gothi were now uncertain what had been agreed on exactly, and began debating among themselves. Meanwhile, Brody and his followers were completely sure that Beerhood was in the right. This was, of course, all part of their plan. Here we can see one of the faults in Icelandic democracy. It was entirely oral, everything from laws to minor cases were never written down. They were recited. So incidents like these could easily be manipulated if the witnesses were prepared. Skafti said, "Where did this wave come from, Beerhood, that lifts you to these heights? I see now that you hold your tail higher than just a moment ago, and who are these men that you've selected for the arbitration?" Beerhood said, "I choose Thorsten and his in-law Brody, and I find it better to be in their hands than yours." Skafti was actually okay with this, since he'd believed Brody and Thorsten to be good men, and that they would support him and his fellow Gothi. They were sensible enough to realize the necessity for punishment. With this conclusion, everyone retired for the night. Next day, the arbitration commenced at the Mountain of Law. Thorsten and Brody wanted to resolve it as quickly as possible, preferably have the compensation paid at the mountain itself. All the Gothi assembled, and they were hopeful that Thorsten would represent a fair compensation. Thorsten explained that the forest which Gothi owned had been of poor value. It was a bad forest, isolated and of little use to them. It was selfish of those that had so much to lay claim to that property. Because they had been unable to save their own forest, they were partly responsible for it burning down. But since the case had been made in arbitration, they should be paid a compensation, in the form of cloth. This was a special type of coarse, dense wool fabric, known as vadmal. It has been produced in the Scandinavian culture since ancient times, and pretty much up to our modern day. It was vital to the Viking economy and a valued trade product on Iceland. Brody had prepared and measured the vadmal, and tossed a piece to each of the Gothi. Next, Brody is going to say some insensitive things which aren't exactly politically correct, at least in our modern day, and kinda not back then. So if you're uncomfortable with homophobia, I'd suggest you click away. Brody said of the cloth, "Such I call a faggot's payment." Viking society wasn't exactly friendly towards the people of the rainbow orientation, and calling another man a homosexual was the gravest of insults. The Gothi were furious. Skafti said, "It is obvious that you want to fight with us, Brody. You've played an important part in this case, but you might only improve our chances of winning further ones against you." Brody replied, "You might need to win other cases, Skafti, if you wish to fill the hole which your relative Orm did in you, after the love poem you wrote for his wife." A Gothi named Thorkel Trefil replied, "Brody is making a huge mistake. He wishes to make a friend of Beerhood, or he has accepted a bribe, whilst making an enemy of powerful men he shouldn't." Brody said, "There is no mistake in remaining faithful, even if there's a difference in rank between you and Beerhood. However, you made a mistake this spring, when you rode to the thing and failed to notice Steingrim's fat stallion as he came up and assaulted you from behind. The mare you rode was skinny and buckled under you, and I'm not sure which one of you the stallion fucked, but you were seen sitting there for a while, with the stallion's forelegs over your cape." Eyolf Thordarson said, "It is true that this man has deceived us, and that he acts like a bully towards us." Brody said, "I haven't deceived you. However, you were deceived when you traveled north and stole oxes from Torkel Eriksson. Guftalastari followed you, but you saw your pursuers and shapeshifted into a mare, bringing much shame unto you. Stari recovered the oxen, and you were the one deceived." Then Snorri Gothi said, "Whatever we may do is better for us than standing here and exchanging pleasantries with Brody, though it is likely we remember this animosity when the opportunity arises." Brody said, "You have a strange sense of honor, Snorri, if you put all your energy into retaliating against me when you haven't even avenged your father." Torkel Gatisson said, "It appears as if you wish to make an enemy of us all, but no one will appreciate it, and you'll surely be killed one day, sooner or later." Brody and Thorkel were relatives, and it seems there had been some internal conflicts in the family. Brody said that there's little honor in publicizing our family's misery, but many already know that Brodhelgi was slain. I don't know who Brodhelgi was, likely a close relative to Brody. Brody continued, "But I've also heard it said that your father received the same payment, and should you search yourself, your fingers will find the scars which my father gave you at Bötvarstall." After this, the case concluded, and everyone returned to their shacks. Beerhood was a free man, and after this, we don't know what happened to him. He had gone up against 6 of the island's most powerful Gothi, and walked out a winner. Whether this incident culled his arrogance or bolstered it, we don't know. Maybe he discovered a more humble side to himself, and lived out the rest of his days, selling beer at the thing, and hopefully not starting any more fires. When watching over a fire, a good trick is to sit up on a piece of firewood. Thus, if you fall asleep, you'll fall over and wake yourself up. The day after the arbitration, Brody paid Torkel Gatisson a visit. The latter was understandably furious. Brody apologized for what he had said, blaming it on his youth and foolishness, and that he didn't want this to affect their kinship. To apologize, he offered Torkel a jeweled sword, and invited the man to live with him during summer. Torkel thanked him, and that same summer visited and lived with Brody for a few weeks, receiving more excellent gifts. They retained a good relationship for the rest of their lives. All things considered, we ended our story on quite a wholesome note. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.